Have you ever wondered how a great power and empire actually declines? It's this huge question, right? In this explainer, we're going to break down a framework for that exact cycle. And then we're going to try and pinpoint where the United States might be on that timeline. So let's dive in.
So here's the core idea we're exploring. It's not some big Hollywood explosion. Empires don't just collapse. Instead, they decline in stages. The pattern is almost always financial before it's political, and it's structural long before you can see it on the news. This completely reframes the whole conversation away from collapse and towards a much more analytical process. And that, of course, brings us to the big question. If this is a cycle, if it's a predictable pattern, then where exactly is the US on this timeline right now? That's what we're here to figure out.
Okay, so first things first, and this is really key. Empires don't just explode. The decline is subtle. The real forces at play are usually way beneath the surface, things like debt levels, productivity, monetary policy. They build up slowly, like pressure in a fault line, long before any major cracks appear.
Which brings us right to the core of this whole thing, the 7-stage cycle of an empire. You can think of it as a roadmap, a sequence of events that tends to repeat throughout history. Let's take a look at the full cycle. So here it is, all 7 stages laid out. It starts strong with a solid foundation in production. That leads to financial expansion and then, eventually, global dominance. But then you hit a turning point. The very tools that created all that power, like debt and finance, they start to create their own problems, leading the empire down a path toward erosion and finally some kind of transition. So, stages 1 through 3, that's the climb to the top. Think about early America's industrial power, which just grew and grew until, after World War II, when the US dollar basically became the world's money. In these early stages, power is built on stuff you can touch, on real output, trusted credit, and global influence. All right, now stage 4. This is where things get really interesting. This is the critical turning point. You can almost see the scales tipping here. Financial engineering starts to become more profitable than actually making things. Debt starts growing faster than the real economy. And to keep things going, the economy becomes more and more dependent on low interest rates and monetary stimulus. Basically, making money cheaper to borrow becomes the main engine of growth. And this is where things get personal, because according to the framework we're looking at, this is where the United States finds itself today, at a checkpoint called Stage 5. Now hold on, this isn't a declaration of doom. It's an analytical assessment of a very specific set of financial conditions. So what is Stage 5? It's got this name, debt saturation, and it's pretty much what it sounds like. This is the point where the whole system is just so full of debt that paying the interest on it becomes a huge line item in the national budget. It doesn't mean the system is broken, not at all, but it has way less room to maneuver when a crisis hits. And the evidence, well, it's pretty clear when you look at the indicators for the US today. We've got a historically high debt to GDP ratio. That's the country's total debt compared to its entire economic output. We see that interest payments are becoming one of the fastest growing government expenses. And we're running huge deficits even when the economy is supposed to be doing well. These are the classic fingerprints of Stage 5. And this is so important to remember, Stage 5 isn't game over. It's not destiny. It's really more of a crossroads. As the quote says, it's pressure. And that pressure can be a catalyst for real reform, or it can just lead to more erosion. The outcome is not written in stone. So what happens if that pressure just keeps building and it's not addressed? Well, that's what can lead to Stage 6. The shift from the pressure of Stage 5 to the erosion of Stage 6 is subtle, but it's one of the most critical transitions in this entire cycle. And here's the difference, boiled down. In Stage 5, global confidence in the country's debt is just there. It's automatic, it's assumed, but in Stage 6, suddenly that confidence becomes conditional. Investors start to ask questions, they want proof, they start demanding higher interest rates because they're starting to see more risk. That's the huge shift. So how does that shift actually happen? Well, it's not because of one bad headline. It's because of these 5 structural triggers you see here. And notice, these are all slow-moving trends. Things like a sustained rise in borrowing costs, or deficits that just never seem to shrink. It's also when other countries start to slowly move their money away from your debt, and faith in your policymakers begins to fray. But the most dangerous trigger, the real trap, is this: a self-reinforcing debt loop. It works like this. Interest rates go up, which means the government has to pay more on its debt. That makes the deficit bigger, which forces the government to borrow even more money. And all that new borrowing can push interest rates even higher. and you can see how the cycle just starts feeding on itself.
Okay, but let's pull back from the edge for a second. Remember, stage 5 is a choice point, not a final stop. The pressure is definitely on, but history shows us there are ways to navigate this. So let's look at the 4 potential paths forward from this moment of debt saturation.
To really get a grip on the paths forward, you kind of have to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. This 7-stage cycle often plays out over a long-term debt cycle, which tends to last around 80 years, like the one that began after World War II. Reaching the end of one of these cycles, which is where we are now, doesn't guarantee a crisis, but it does mean we're at a major structural turning point. And when you look back at history, these long cycles usually wrap up in one of 3 ways. You can try to inflate the debt away, or you can have a really painful deflationary crash that just wipes the slate clean. Or, the best case scenario, you can innovate your way out of the problem with a massive productivity boom. So, digging in a little deeper, what's the playbook for getting out of a stage 5 situation? Historically, there have been 4 main paths. The ideal one is a productivity shock. A tech revolution like AI that makes the whole economy so much bigger that the debt looks small by comparison. The other paths involve things like gradual fiscal discipline, carefully using inflation to lower the real value of the debt, or, the hardest way, being forced into reform by a crisis. But no matter which path is taken, the key variable is this: trajectory. The goal is to bend the curve, to get your economy growing faster than your debt. And the absolutely critical part is doing this before you tip into stage 6. Because once global confidence becomes conditional, the cost of fixing the problem goes up exponentially. Now, we have to be fair here. The U.S. is not going into this challenge empty-handed. Not at all. It's still holding some incredibly powerful cards. The world's reserve currency, the deepest financial markets on the planet, a huge lead in technology, and massive energy resources. These are powerful, powerful tools for engineering a reversal. And that brings us to a quote that just perfectly wraps this all up. Stage 5 is arithmetic. It's just the cold, hard numbers of debt and interest. Stage 6 is perception, how the world feels about those numbers. But in the long run, perception always follows the arithmetic. And that's really where we are now, isn't it? For a long time, the math was kind of easy to ignore because interest rates were basically 0. That's just not the world we live in anymore. The underlying arithmetic is getting louder, it's getting more insistent, and it's forcing a conversation about what comes next. So we end up right back where we started, but now with a much clearer map. The U.S. is at a structural checkpoint. It has the tools for reform, it has incredible underlying strengths, but it also faces the relentless compounding of that arithmetic. The only real question left is, which path will be chosen?